She had been invisible for 6 months. Every morning, Evelyn Cross walked that range with a bucket and a broom, collecting the spent brass that legends left behind. The instructors never learned her name. The soldiers looked straight through her. And Commander Mason Voss, the most decorated sniper in the program's history, had never once acknowledged she existed, until the morning he decided to humiliate her in front of everyone. He pointed at a target on Blackstone Ridge, nearly 4,000 meters, a distance that broke careers. "Go ahead," he said, grinning at his team. "Prove you belong here." Nobody was laughing 60 seconds later. If this story already has your pulse running, hit subscribe and stay until the end. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And don't miss what's coming next, because the truth behind Evelyn Cross is darker and stranger than anyone on that range could have imagined. The alarm on Evelyn's phone went off at 04:30, same as every morning, but she was already awake. She lay on the cot in her quarters, a converted storage room at the back of the maintenance building, staring at the ceiling with both hands folded across her stomach. The room smelled like solvent and old canvas. A single bare bulb hung overhead. She hadn't bothered replacing the lampshade that had broken 3 weeks ago. She listened. Wind against the prefab walls. The distant thrum of the HVAC unit on the administration building. A coyote somewhere out past the perimeter wire, working itself up about something. And beneath all of it, barely audible, the sound she always waited for, the flag on the main range snapping once, sharply, then settling. Northwest. 6, maybe 8 knots. She sat up. Evelyn Cross was 34 years old, 5'7", and built like someone who had spent serious time carrying weight over difficult terrain, which she had, though not in any capacity listed in her current employment file. Her hair was brown going gray at the temples in a way that made her look older than she was, and she kept it pinned back in a bun so tight it gave her headaches by noon. She had a scar below her left ear that she never explained, and brown eyes that registered everything while appearing to register nothing. Her official title at Redstone Valor Training Facility was Range Maintenance Technician, Grade 2, which meant she cleaned things. She pulled on her uniform, the tan coveralls that identified her as support staff, not military, and laced her boots in the dark. Redstone Valor sat in the high desert of southern Utah, 40 miles from the nearest town with a gas station, and the isolation was deliberate. The facility trained precision long-range shooters for military and federal law enforcement contracts. The instructors were former special operations. The students were the best their respective units had to offer. The range itself was engineered for extreme distances, with terrain that created variable wind conditions no simulator could replicate. Thermal updrafts off the canyon walls, crosswinds that reversed direction twice within the same 100-meter corridor, elevation shifts that ate bullet trajectories alive. It was, according to people who knew such things, one of the most technically demanding shooting environments on the planet. It was also, according to Evelyn, the best place in the country to study long-range ballistics without anyone paying attention to you. She had been here 6 months. She had arrived in January with a legitimate maintenance resume she'd spent 2 years building, real certifications, real references from real facilities, and a secondary set of reasons for being here that appeared nowhere in her application. Her uncle had worked here. Master Sergeant Caleb Cross, United States Army, retired, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment and later an instructor for a Joint Service Precision Marksmanship program whose official name changed every 4 years but whose function never did. He had trained at Redstone Valor twice, consulted here 3 times, and died here, officially, in a training accident involving a vehicle rollover on the North Access Road 14 months ago. Evelyn did not believe that. She believed it less with every week she spent walking this facility, watching the way certain instructors went quiet when his name came up, the way Commander Voss changed the subject, the one time a student asked about a photograph on the trophy wall that included Caleb's face. She believed it less every time she found small inconsistencies in the facility's maintenance logs from around the date of his death, fuel records that didn't match, vehicle inspection reports that had been filed after the fact, a medical response log that listed arrival times she knew were impossible given the road conditions that night. She was not a detective, but Caleb had spent 15 years teaching her to read a scene the same way she read a firing lane, systematically, without assumptions, looking for what didn't fit. So she cleaned the range, she picked up casings, she stayed invisible, and she learned everything she could. The morning routine at Redstone Valor was rigid in the way that military environments always were, organized around schedules and hierarchy and the comfortable fiction that structure meant control. Reveille for the current training cohort was 0500, physical training until 0630, breakfast, then range operations from 0800 until the light failed or the wind made work pointless, whichever came first. Evelyn was on the range by 0600 before anyone else, which was how she preferred it. She walked the firing line first, checking for anything that could cause a safety problem. A divot in the pad where someone had dragged equipment, a damaged target anchor stake at the 500-meter mark, brass that had rolled into the drainage channel along the eastern wall. She found 2 ejected cases that had missed the collection area from yesterday's afternoon session and pocketed them. She checked the wind indicators at the 500, 1,000, and 2,000-meter posts, the fabric telltales that the instructors used during training, and found the one at 1,000 had frayed overnight. She made a note. She'd replace it before first call. The sky was turning from black to a deep bruised purple over the ridgeline when she heard boots on gravel behind her. She didn't turn around. "You're early." She recognized the voice. Staff Sergeant Derek Kwan, one of the junior instructors. 28, former Army. Decent shooter, but better at managing students than he was on the gun himself, a quality the instructors here tended to undervalue. He'd been the only one in 6 months who consistently said good morning to her. "Frayed telltale at the 1,000 mark," she said. "Wanted to get it before the wind picked up." Kwan walked up beside her and looked out at the range. The light was coming now, fast the way it did in the desert. "Wind's supposed to shift around 10. Commander Voss wants to run the long-range qualification sequence today." "Shifting or reversing?" He looked at her sideways. "Reversing. Why?" "Because the shift always comes from the canyon side at this time of year, and it doesn't reverse. It oscillates. 20 to 25-minute cycles. If he's running the long qualification starting at 10, the first relay is going to catch the oscillation right at the peak. Students will be reading one wind and shooting into another." Kwan was quiet for a moment. "I'll mention it." "You won't." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Probably not." He paused. "How do you know that?" "About the oscillation cycles." "I've been walking this range for 6 months. There's walking a range and there's—" He stopped, looked at her, said nothing else, which was more perceptive than she'd expected. Evelyn crouched down and pulled the frayed telltale from the post anchor. "Tell Commander Voss the 1,000-meter indicator was compromised. He'll want it logged." "Sure." Kwan hesitated another moment, then headed toward the armory building. Evelyn watched the ridge line. The sky was fully purple now, bleeding toward orange at the edges. She'd seen Caleb watch the same ridge once, from a photograph she'd found in a box of his effects that his estate, her essentially, had received after his death. He was squinting into the light with his hand shading his eyes. He looked comfortable. He looked like he was home. She folded the damaged telltale and put it in her bucket and kept walking. The training cohort this rotation was 12 shooters, a mix of federal law enforcement and military, at varying skill levels, but all with demonstrated baseline proficiency. They arrived on the range at 0755, loud and organized in the way of people who had done this enough to be comfortable, but not so much that they'd gone quiet. They set up their positions at the firing line with the practiced efficiency of professionals, checking equipment, comparing notes on yesterday's performance, doing the small rituals that shooters do before a session. Evelyn moved along the far edge of the range, straightening the target frame anchors at the 200-meter mark, staying out of the way. Commander Mason Voss arrived at exactly 0800. I was 51 years old, and he moved through a space the way a person moves when they've spent decades being the most capable individual in any given room. Not arrogant, exactly, though he was that too, but with a particular kind of settled authority that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything that mattered. He was tall, lean, in the way of a man who maintained himself like equipment, with gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been designed to hold a jaw. He wore his instructor's uniform like it was a second skin. He had been decorated 3 times for long-range precision work in combat conditions. He held a facility record at 3,200 meters that had stood for 7 years. He had trained shooters who had gone on to distinguished careers in environments whose names never appeared in official records. He was also, Evelyn had concluded over 6 months of careful observation, exactly the kind of man who had never once questioned whether his understanding of a situation was complete. She'd seen him walk the range without looking at the wind indicators. He didn't need to. He could read conditions in his sleep. But that confidence meant he never noticed what the conditions were doing in the early morning hours before the range opened, when no one was watching, when the wind did things that didn't match the forecast. Caleb had noticed those things. It was the first thing he'd ever taught her. The wind doesn't care what the instruments say. The wind has its own logic. You have to learn to hear it. Listen up. Voss's voice carried easily over the range without effort. Today we're running the long-range qualification sequence. Positions 1 through 4 will shoot the 500 to 2000 relay starting at 0830. Positions 5 through 8 will observe and record. We rotate after lunch. He moved down the line looking at setups, making small corrections. I also want to see your dope books before first relay. If you're still writing down yesterday's data and calling it today's, you're going to miss. One of the students, a female Army sergeant named Reyes, compact and serious with good fundamentals, raised a hand. Sir, Weather Service is showing wind shift around 1000. How do you want to handle? Noted. Voss said it without looking up from the rifle he was checking. The shift will affect positions 2 and 3 most. Adjust your firing solution before you send, not after. Evelyn, working near the frame anchors at the 200-meter mark, heard this and said nothing. Quan had not mentioned the oscillation. She hadn't expected him to. The morning session ran well. These were competent shooters. Not exceptional, most of them, but competent. And watching them work the range reminded Evelyn of something Caleb had told her once, that the distance between a good shooter and a great one had almost nothing to do with marksmanship and everything to do with what happened between the shots. The thinking, the adjustments, the willingness to be wrong. She watched them from the edges, collecting the brass that landed outside the designated catch areas, straightening the flagging tape on the course boundaries, doing her job. At 0947, the wind shifted. She felt it before the telltales showed it. A subtle change in the thermal quality of the air coming off the canyon wall. A drop in surface temperature of maybe 2 degrees. Within 90 seconds, every indicator on the range had swung 12 degrees off their previous readings, and the oscillation she'd described to Quan was in its active phase. Position 3. A federal agent named Hollis, decent technique but slow in his adjustments, sent a shot at the 1500-meter mark and missed long right by what Evelyn estimated from the spotting scope reaction was about 4 meters. Voss walked to the position. What happened? Wind kicked, sir. I was reading. You were reading the 500-meter indicator. You should have been reading the terrain. The canyon changes everything east of 1200. Adjust your dope and reshoot. Hollis nodded. Resent. Hit, but barely. Evelyn replaced the drainage cover near the eastern wall and moved toward the ammunition storage area. She passed within 3 meters of Commander Voss. He didn't look at her. Oh. The afternoon was quieter. The second relay performed better. They'd watched the morning group manage the wind oscillation and learned from it, which was its own kind of skill. Voss ran a debrief at the 200-meter shooting bench at 1600 hours that Evelyn could hear from the equipment shed, where she was inventorying spare target frames. Your data is only as good as your environment reading, Voss was saying. A firing solution that works at 0800 is not the same firing solution at 400. Different temperature, different humidity, different barrel temp on the weapon. If you're plugging yesterday's numbers into today's shot, you're guessing. I don't train guessers. Evelyn set a damaged frame aside and picked up another. From where she stood, she could see through the shed's open door to the briefing area. Could see Voss at the front, could see the students watching him, could see Reyes in the second row with her notebook open, writing something down. She could also see, on the bench beside Voss, the rifle. It was a modified .338 Lapua Magnum on a Macmillan stock that she'd have recognized in complete darkness. The serial number had been partially obscured at some point, a maintenance modification that wasn't in any log she could find. But the stock had a specific repair on the comb, a dark epoxy patch over a crack that had been filled and refinished that she knew the history of. She knew it because she had watched it happen. Caleb had cracked the stock during a training exercise in New Mexico 11 years ago, and she'd been there when he did it, and she'd watched him fix it himself in a motel parking lot with hardware store epoxy and patience. That was Caleb's rifle. It was sitting on Commander Voss's briefing bench like it belonged there. Evelyn set down the target frame very carefully. She breathed. She made no sound. She had known the rifle was somewhere at this facility. She'd been looking for it. But seeing it in Voss's possession, used casually, as range equipment, as a prop for his afternoon debrief, made something cold move through her chest that she spent a long moment not doing anything about. She picked up the next frame, checked it, added it to the stack. Outside, Voss was still talking. Tomorrow we're extending the qualification distance. I want everyone at 2,500 before end of week. If you're not ready, the range will tell us. The debrief ended. Students moved out in ones and twos. Voss stayed to talk with Quan, something low and operational that she couldn't make out. Evelyn finished the inventory, locked the shed, and walked back toward the maintenance building with her bucket. She didn't look at the rifle again, but she knew what she'd seen, and she knew it changed what happened next. That night, she pulled out the cardboard box she kept under the cot, the one that looked, if anyone had ever bothered looking, like it contained cleaning supplies. It did contain cleaning supplies. It also contained other things. A notebook in which she'd been recording her observations for 6 months, written in a shorthand she'd developed herself during the years she'd spent doing field work she was not currently discussing. A USB drive with copies of documents she'd managed to photograph. A ballistic chart, handwritten, for the rifle she'd just seen on Voss's bench, covering distances from 800 to 5,000 meters in 200-meter increments, accounting for altitude, standard atmospheric conditions in the Utah high desert, and the specific barrel characteristics of that weapon, which she knew because she had shot it 300 times before Caleb gave it to her for her 28th birthday, and then asked for it back 6 months later when he said he needed it for a consultation. He'd looked uncomfortable when he said it. She hadn't pressed him. She should have pressed him. She also pulled out a battered piece of equipment that was hard to describe to people who didn't know what they were looking at. Caleb had called it his broken calculator. It was technically a field ballistic computer, a purpose-built device for calculating firing solutions under variable conditions. And it was technically broken in the sense that the LCD screen had a crack across the lower left quadrant that made some of the characters unreadable, and the casing had taken damage that left it held together partly by friction and partly by 2 wraps of electrician's tape. But the processor worked. The sensors worked. The database of projectile ballistic coefficients that Caleb had spent years building and inputting worked. She had found it in his things after his death. It hadn't been on any inventory of his personal effects. It hadn't been logged by the facility. It was just in the bottom of a box of old paperwork that had been shipped to her without anyone apparently noticing what it was. She turned it on now. The cracked screen flickered, then held. She entered the atmospheric data she'd recorded during the afternoon session. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. She noted the wind oscillation timing from her morning observations. Then she looked at the numbers she'd entered for Blackstone Ridge, the landmark 3.8 kilometers northeast of the facility, visible from the main range on clear days, where target frames occasionally got placed for maximum distance demonstrations that Voss ran for VIP visitors. She had been doing this math, quietly, for weeks. Not because she planned anything, but because math was the way she thought, and the math here kept pulling her toward the same answer, and she kept wanting to check it. The computer gave her the same number it always did. She turned it off and put it away, and lay down on the cot and listened to the coyote again, farther out now, working on something across the valley. She did not sleep for a long time. The next morning, she was on the range at 0545, early even for her. She was checking the west boundary flagging when she heard the vehicles, 3 of them, coming through the main gate an hour ahead of schedule. Staff cars, not troop carriers. She recognized Colonel Hale's vehicle by the antenna configuration, which told her this was administrative traffic, not training support. Something had shifted in the facility's schedule. She didn't know what yet. She kept working. She noted the vehicles. She noted that Voss was visible outside the administration building, talking with 2 people she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, federal agency posture, the particular way people stood when they were there officially but didn't want to look like it. She replaced a boundary flag that had come loose from its stake in the night wind. At 0755, when the cohort arrived, the energy on the range was different, tighter. Students were quieter than usual. Voss ran the morning briefing without the extended tactical discussion he usually included. Shorter, more procedural, like a man managing his attention between the briefing and something else. At 0840, with the first relay still setting up, Commander Voss walked toward the equipment shed with the two unknown civilians and stopped when he apparently noticed for the first time that Evelyn was close enough to hear. He looked at her. It was, she realized, the first time in 6 months that he had looked at her with anything other than total absence of interest. You. He said it like he was identifying a piece of misplaced equipment. What's your name? Cross, sir. Maintenance. Cross. He said the name without any visible recognition. You've been on this range all morning? Yes, sir. Doing what? My job, sir. One of the civilians, a woman, mid-40s, short dark hair, expression that gave nothing, glanced at Voss. Some kind of communication passed between them. Voss looked back at Evelyn. Give us some space. Yes, sir. She picked up her bucket and moved toward the far end of the range, not hurrying. She heard the civilian woman say something about the files from the North Building as she walked away. The North Building was where the classified training records were kept. Evelyn set her bucket down at the 200-meter boundary and spent a moment checking a stake she didn't actually need to check, and thought about what she'd just seen, and thought about the rifle on the bench, and thought about Caleb. The moment they start watching you, he'd told her once, during a training exercise in a different state, a different life, is the moment you need to be most careful about what you want them to see. Behind her, Commander Voss and the two civilians continued their conversation in the direction of the North Building. Evelyn Cross straightened her stake, picked up her bucket, and kept working, and the morning moved toward the moment that would make everything that came before it irrelevant. At 1:10, during a break between relays, it happened. She was near the firing line, collecting cases that had rolled off the bench during the morning's first relay, when she heard Voss say her name, not Cross, maintenance, the way he'd used it before, but her name specifically. That woman. The one who's always on the range. She looked up without meaning to. He was standing at the firing bench with 3 of his senior instructors, including Quan. He was holding a spotting scope loosely in one hand. He was looking at her. Come here. He said it loud enough that the students still on the line turned to look. She walked over. She set down the bucket. Up close, Voss was evaluating her with the same systematic assessment he applied to equipment, functional or non-functional, useful or irrelevant. He had a way of looking at people that didn't include them as people. I heard you tell Quan this morning about the wind oscillation cycles. She said nothing. That wasn't a question. You know what an oscillation cycle is? Yes, sir. Where'd you learn that? The honest answer was, from the man whose rifle you're using as a prop. She said, I've been on this range a long time, sir. You watch the wind long enough, you start to understand it. One of the other instructors, a heavy man named Pratt, who she'd never liked, made a sound under his breath. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. Voss's expression didn't change. You know ballistics? Some. How much is some? Enough to know what I don't know, sir. Pratt actually laughed at that. She said enough to know what she doesn't know. He looked at the other instructors like this was the funniest thing he'd heard. Voss wasn't laughing. He was still watching her. You know what a ballistic coefficient is? It's the measure of a projectile's ability to overcome air resistance in flight. Expressed as a decimal representing the ratio of the bullet's sectional density to its coefficient of form. Higher BC means less velocity loss over distance and less drift in crosswind conditions. The laughing stopped. Quan's expression was carefully neutral. The other instructors were looking at her like she'd just spoken in a language they hadn't expected. Voss was quiet for a moment. Where are you from, Cross? Montana, sir. Family? She met his eyes. My uncle taught me to shoot. Voss set down the spotting scope on the bench, slowly. He picked up the rifle, Caleb's rifle, the rifle she'd grown up with, the rifle she'd made 300 shots with, and held it out toward her across the bench. Show me. The range went completely quiet. She could feel the students watching, could feel Pratt's smirk waiting to come back, could feel Quan's careful stillness. She looked at the rifle. She looked at Voss. Show you what, sir? Anything. He set the rifle down on the bench. Show me you know what you're talking about. Take a position. Read the conditions. Take a shot. She looked at the targets downrange. The nearest qualification target was at 500 meters. Standard stuff. She could make that shot in her sleep, and she knew he knew she could make that shot in her sleep. And doing it would prove nothing, and they both knew that too. She looked at Blackstone Ridge. Commander Voss followed her gaze. Then he smiled. It was a specific kind of smile. The smile of a man who has issued a challenge he expects to be declined, and who has already planned what to say about the declining. That's 3,800 meters. No one on this range has made that shot. You said to show you anything. I did. Then set up a target on the ridge. The smile didn't leave his face, but it changed, hardened, became something more interested and less kind. He turned to Pratt. Set up a frame on the ridge, Pratt blinked. Sir, that's a 4-kilometer. I said set it up. While Pratt and a student took the vehicle out to Blackstone Ridge with a target frame, Evelyn stood at the firing bench and did not touch the rifle. She pulled out the broken ballistic computer from her coverall pocket. What is that? Voss asked. Field ballistic computer, sir. He looked at it. The cracked screen, the electrician's tape, with something she couldn't quite read. That's antique equipment. Yes, sir. She turned it on. The cracked screen flickered. The atmospheric sensors took their readings. She entered what she knew. The current temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, ambient. Humidity at 24%. Barometric pressure at 29.41 inches, which she knew because she'd logged it at 0600. Altitude of the firing position at 4,147 feet above sea level, the elevation of Blackstone Ridge slightly higher at 5,100. An uphill shot that changed the ballistic solution in ways that counters and scopes often didn't account for correctly. Bullet. 338 Lapua, Magnum, 300 grain Sierra Match King, BC .743. Muzzle velocity for this specific barrel, she knew it. 2,700 feet per second, verified over a chronograph 3 years ago, with an estimated velocity retention curve she'd modeled herself. Distance, 3,847 meters, approximately. Wind at the firing position, 7 knots northwest. Wind at 1,000 meters, variable, rotating through the canyon, currently approximately 5 knots northeast. Wind at 2,000 plus, unknown, but based on the ridgeline geometry and the pressure gradient. She'd been watching all morning. She estimated 10 to 14 knots from the southwest at altitude. Time of flight to target, approximately 7 seconds. 7 seconds during which every environmental variable would act on the bullet independently. 7 seconds during which the bullet would drop nearly 80 meters due to gravity, requiring the scope to be dialed to compensate. 7 seconds during which wind drift could push the projectile 3, 4, 5 meters sideways, depending on what the air was doing at which point in the trajectory. 7 seconds. The ballistic computer gave her a solution. She looked at it. She ran the calculation manually in her head. Not because she didn't trust the computer, but because she always checked. It was what Caleb had demanded. Trust the math, but verify the math. And then trust the math. The computer's solution and her manual calculation were within 2% of each other. She dialed the scope on the rifle, Caleb's scope, which she also knew, which she had also shot through, with precise adjustments. 8.4 minutes of angle elevation, 3.1 minutes windage, right. Adjustments for the uphill angle and the altitude differential. She lay down behind the rifle. The stock settled against her shoulder like it remembered her. The students had drifted in from the firing line. She could feel them watching from behind. She could feel Voss watching from her left. She could feel Pratt somewhere behind her right shoulder, waiting. Frames up. Pratt's radio crackled on the bench. Vehicle coming back. Voss looked at the ridge, looked at her, said nothing. Evelyn put her eye to the scope. The target appeared. A standard silhouette frame, white cardboard, at a distance that made it look like a small notation on a distant sentence. The ridge shimmered in the thermal distortion rising off the canyon floor between here and there. The air between the rifle and the target was not stable. It never was. It was a column of constantly moving variables, and she was trying to put a piece of metal through a specific 12-inch zone of that column at a specific moment in time. She breathed. Once in, once out, found the respiratory pause. She watched the flags. She watched the telltales. She watched the distant brush on the canyon wall for the surface-level wind reading. She watched the mirage in the scope for the thermal signature. The wind at 1,000 meters was cycling. She counted the cycle. 19 seconds on one phase, then it shifted. She timed 3 full cycles. 19 seconds, 18 seconds, 21 seconds. She found the average. She would need to shoot in the first 5 seconds of the calm phase. She waited. The wind shifted. She began her count. 1, 2. She settled her grip. Slack out of the trigger. 3. Heartbeat slow. Respiratory pause. Scope picture stable. 4. Everything in her went quiet. She squeezed. The rifle fired. The recoil pushed through her shoulder and she held her position, maintained her picture, heard nothing for the first second because the sound of the shot had rolled out across the desert in a wave and the echo off the canyon wall was still traveling. She tracked the bullet's flight in her mind the way Caleb had taught her, visualizing the arc, the wind drift, the terminal phase as the projectile decelerated through the last 1,000 meters, where bullet stability degraded and small errors compounded. 7 seconds. She counted them. The range was completely silent. The radio on the bench crackled. "Hit," said Pratt's voice, and he didn't sound like himself. He sounded like a man who had just seen something he was going to remember for a long time. "Center. I'm looking at it right now. That's a center hit." Nobody moved. Voss was still looking through his spotting scope. She couldn't see his face. Quan made a sound that wasn't words. Evelyn lifted her head from the scope. She didn't look at anyone. She looked at the ridge. She had just fired her uncle's rifle for the first time in 3 years, and she had hit a target that nobody on this range had ever hit, at a distance that people in this world described as theoretical. And the reason she didn't feel anything close to triumph was that she was still looking at the rifle, and she was still thinking about how it had gotten here. And she was still thinking about the fact that Voss had handled it like equipment, like it was just a tool, like it had no history, like Caleb had no history, like the man who had owned this weapon had just ceased to exist and left his things behind for someone else to use. She pushed herself up from the position and stood. She looked at Commander Voss. He lowered the spotting scope. He looked at her. For the first time in 6 months, he was looking at her the same way he looked at everything else on this range, with the focused attention of a man who had just encountered something he hadn't accounted for and needed to understand it. "Your name is Cross," he said. "Yes, sir." Something moved through his face, gone before she could identify it. "Your uncle, Commander." The voice came from the direction of the administration building. Evelyn turned. The woman with the short dark hair, the civilian from that morning, the one she'd seen with Voss near the north building, was walking toward the range with the deliberate pace of someone who had bad news and was in no hurry to deliver it because the news was not going to improve with speed. Behind her, 2 men in federal law enforcement jackets. "Commander Voss," the woman said again, "we need you inside, now." Voss looked at her, looked at the men behind her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, not quite fear, but something in between that Evelyn filed away carefully. "What's this about?" The woman stopped 5 feet away. She looked at Evelyn, then back at Voss. "It's about Master Sergeant Caleb Cross," she said, "and the night he died." The woman's name was Agent Dana Mercer, and she did not offer her hand. She stood at the edge of the firing line with the 2 federal agents flanking her at a loose distance, close enough to be present, far enough to suggest they weren't there as backup, but as witnesses. And she looked at Commander Voss with the particular expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment and found the reality of it less satisfying than the preparation. "Inside," she said again, "both of you." Voss looked at Evelyn, then at Mercer. "She's maintenance." "I know who she is." Mercer's eyes moved to Evelyn with something that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite acknowledgement. "Ms. Cross, we'll need a few minutes of your time as well." The students on the range had gone very still. Quan was watching with his arms at his sides and his face carefully arranged into professional neutrality, but his eyes were moving between Voss and Evelyn and the federal agents in a way that said he was cataloging everything he saw. Pratt had come back from the ridge retrieval in time to catch the tail end of whatever this was, and he was standing near the vehicle with the target frame still in his hands, looking confused in a way that made him seem younger. Voss handed the spotting scope to Quan without a word. He walked toward the administration building. Evelyn picked up her bucket. "Leave that," Mercer said. She left the bucket. The conference room in the administration building had the standard institutional furniture of every military facility Evelyn had ever been in. A rectangular table that was too large for the room, chairs that were comfortable for approximately 40 minutes before they became instruments of quiet suffering, a whiteboard with old marker traces that hadn't quite cleaned off. A window faced the range, and through it she could see the firing line and the students milling with the uncertain energy of people who'd been told nothing and were waiting for permission to react. Voss sat at the head of the table out of habit or instinct. Mercer sat across from Evelyn, which left Evelyn with her back to the window and the two other agents positioned near the door. Nobody offered water. Mercer opened a folder and set it on the table without turning it toward anyone. She looked at Voss. "How long has this facility been using the Cross rifle?" Voss's jaw moved slightly. "The Cross rifle." "Master Sergeant Caleb Cross, serial number—" She glanced at the folder. "Partially obscured on the receiver. Modified Macmillan stock with an epoxy repair on the comb. You've been using it as range equipment for approximately 13 months. It was inventoried as facility property after the incident." "What incident would that be?" Something moved through Voss's face. "The accident. The vehicle accident." Mercer wrote something in the folder. "Who inventoried it?" "I don't recall the specific, Commander Voss." She said his title the way people said it when they wanted to remind someone that a title was not the same as authority. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to understand that the accuracy of your answers matters significantly right now. Not to me, personally. To the investigation." Voss was quiet. He looked like a man who had spent his career operating in spaces where he understood the rules and was now in a room where the rules were someone else's. "What investigation?" he said. "It came out flat." Not a question. Mercer looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Ms. Cross, can you tell me why you're at this facility?" Evelyn had been waiting for this question for 6 months. She had prepared several versions of an answer. She picked the true one. "I came because my uncle died here, and I don't believe the accident report." The room absorbed that. Voss looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't for 6 months, because she'd been invisible, and the way he had for one long moment on the range, after the shot. He was putting things together. She could see it happening. "Cross," he said, like he was placing a piece. "Caleb Cross was my uncle," she said. "He taught me to shoot starting when I was 11 years old. He taught me ballistics, wind reading, field mathematics, long-range precision marksmanship. He gave me that rifle as a birthday gift when I was 28 and asked for it back 6 months before he died." She looked at him steadily. "I've been wondering about those 6 months." Voss said nothing. Mercer was writing. "The accident report says he went off the North Access Road in a vehicle at approximately 2200 hours, Evelyn continued. "But the medical response log shows the first responders noted rigor mortis onset inconsistent with the death at 2200. Estimated time of death was significantly earlier. Someone logged the incident late." One of the agents near the door shifted his weight. Mercer looked up from her folder. "How did you access the medical response log?" "It was in the range maintenance archives, filed incorrectly under vehicle inspection records." Evelyn paused. "I don't know if that was deliberate or an error. Either way, I read it." Voss stood up. "Sit down, Commander," Mercer said. He didn't sit, but he stopped moving. He put both hands on the table and looked at Mercer and then at Evelyn and then at the window, and the calculations going on behind his eyes were visible in the way that calculations rarely were on a face that practiced concealment as a professional discipline. "I want to know," he said, and his voice was careful, "exactly what you think happened." "I don't think anything," Evelyn said. "I've been collecting data for 6 months. I don't have enough of it yet to think anything." "But you have a direction." "Yes." He looked at her. "And what direction is that?" She looked at Mercer. Mercer gave her a small, precise nod. "Someone knew when my uncle would be on that road," Evelyn said. "Someone knew the timing of his return from the North Range. Someone had access to the facility's internal schedule, which is not public, and to the access road, which requires an entry code that changes weekly." She kept her voice level. Facts were not accusations. Caleb had taught her that too. "The vehicle showed signs of mechanical interference that the accident investigation attributed to deferred maintenance. But the maintenance logs for that vehicle show it was serviced 11 days before the incident. Brakes, steering, Full safety inspection. Signed off. By who? Voss said. By you, she said. The room went completely quiet. Voss didn't move. His hands were still flat on the table. I was looking at her with something she couldn't immediately categorize. Not guilt, not anger, but something rawer than either. Something that might have been recognition. You think I killed him, he said. I think you signed a form, she said. I don't know yet what that means. Mercer sent Evelyn to wait in a smaller office down the hall while she continued with Voss. The smaller office had a single desk, a computer that was turned off, and a framed facility map on the wall that showed Redstone Valor's layout from an aerial perspective. Evelyn sat in the chair and looked at the map and thought about nothing specific and everything simultaneously, the way she always processed, by letting the information move around until it organized itself. One of the agents was in the hallway outside the door, not blocking it exactly, but present. She could hear Mercer's voice through the wall. Not words, just tone, the flat cadence of someone asking structured questions. Voss's voice lower, harder to read. After 20 minutes, Quan knocked and came in without being invited, which she found interesting. You okay? He asked. Fine. He sat on the edge of the desk, which was casual enough to be deliberate. That was your uncle's rifle. It wasn't a question. Yes. You've been here 6 months and you never said anything. What would I have said? He looked at the map. I didn't know about the accident report. Most people didn't. Voss never talked about it, about Cross, about any of it. He was quiet for a moment. Your uncle was here the year before I joined the program. I've heard the name. He stopped. Say it. He was supposed to be the best long-range shooter this facility ever produced. Quan looked at her. And then what happened today? He didn't finish that either. Ask the question, Quan. He met her eyes. Did he teach you everything you know? She thought about that. He tried. She paused. I was a better student than he expected. Quan nodded slowly. He stood from the desk, looked at the door, looked back. For what it's worth, what you did out there today. That wasn't maintenance work. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He left. She went back to looking at the map. They kept her in the building until 1600, which cost her the afternoon range sweep and was going to require a late correction or the morning crew would start on a dirty line. She noted this with a part of her brain that had nothing to do with everything else and thought it was telling, somehow, that the maintenance concern was still there, running quietly in the background like a system that didn't know it had been taken off active duty. Mercer came to the small office at 15:45 and sat in the chair across from Evelyn and put her folder on the desk and looked at it for a moment before she looked at Evelyn. I'm going to tell you some things, she said, and I need you to understand that some of what I'm telling you is part of an active federal investigation, which means it goes no further than this room. Understood. We've been looking at this facility for 8 months. Mercer folded her hands on the folder. Not because of your uncle, initially. There's a separate contracting irregularity involving training certifications that were issued for personnel who never completed the required course hours. That investigation led us to some financial records. Those financial records led us to a name. She paused. Victor Kane. The name landed in Evelyn's chest like a stone into still water. She kept her expression where it was. You know that name, Mercer said. My uncle mentioned it once, 3 years ago. He said Kane was someone he'd put a case against years back, a former shooter who'd gone private. Kane was running live fire contracts in environments where the rules of engagement were... She stopped. My uncle was careful about how he described it. Kane was running assassination contracts, Mercer said flatly. Targeted killings under the cover of private security operations. Your uncle built a file on him over approximately 2 years and passed it to federal authorities. Kane was never formally charged. The evidence had chain of custody problems. But he lost his operating contracts and his access to domestic training facilities. Mercer looked at the folder. He blamed your uncle for that, specifically and loudly. Evelyn was quiet. The financial records we pulled in the contracting investigation show payments from a shell company linked to Kane to an individual at this facility, starting approximately 3 years ago. Mercer looked up. We believe Kane contracted someone here to identify when your uncle would be vulnerable and facilitate access. The access road, Evelyn said. The access code for the North Road was logged as changed 2 days after the incident. Standard rotation, but we found evidence that the prior code was communicated externally before the incident. Someone sent it out. To Kane. We believe so. Mercer tapped the folder. The individual receiving payments was not Commander Voss. Evelyn took a breath. Voss signed the vehicle maintenance form because it was assigned to him, and the vehicle was, in fact, in acceptable condition at the time of his inspection, Mercer continued. What happened to that vehicle between his inspection and the night of the incident is what we're still working. She paused. The person receiving payments is a former logistics coordinator who separated from the facility 8 months ago. We've had difficulty locating him. She looked at Evelyn carefully. Commander Voss has been cooperating with us for approximately 6 weeks. That landed differently. He's been cooperating, Evelyn said. He came to us. Mercer said it without emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. He had suspicions about the vehicle incident for some time and didn't know how to address them through channels he trusted. When our investigation made contact through the contracting inquiry, he initiated a meeting. Evelyn looked at the facility map on the wall. The range was at the northern end of the diagram, a long, narrow rectangle. The north access road ran along the eastern perimeter. She'd walked that road twice in 6 months, in the dark, measuring distances between landmarks, trying to reconstruct what she could not reconstruct because she hadn't been here. So what do you need from me? She said. We need the ballistic computer, Mercer said. The one your uncle built. The one you've had in your pocket for 6 months. Evelyn went very still. We believe Kane used a shooter, Mercer said. The vehicle incident may not have been mechanical failure. There are elements of the crash site that our reconstruction team thinks are consistent with a precision strike on the vehicle. Not explosive, not conventional. Something that caused a catastrophic steering failure at a specific moment on a specific curve. She met Evelyn's eyes. Your uncle's computer has a trajectory database your uncle built over 20 years. We believe it may include ballistic data from some of Kane's known contracts. Data your uncle was collecting as part of his file. If we can match trajectories, match them to what? Mercer was quiet for just a moment. There was a second vehicle at the site. We found tire evidence in a position consistent with an Overwatch location on the ridge above the North Road. She paused again. We found a single brass casing, 45 meters from the vehicle. Evelyn stood up. Ms. Cross, what caliber? Mercer looked at her for a long moment. .338 La Pua. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, something internal. Someone shot my uncle, Evelyn said. Not a question. We believe the shot disabled the vehicle. Whether it was intended to kill him directly or stage the accident, we don't yet. Someone used a .338 La Pua and a precision position on the ridge to put my uncle's vehicle off that road. She was working through it out loud, not for Mercer's benefit, but because she needed to hear it constructed into words. From a distance, from a hide. Yes. Kane hired a shooter. That's what the evidence suggests. Evelyn stood at the window and looked at the range and thought about 7 seconds. About the time a bullet traveled 3,847 meters. About the physics of it, the intimacy and the distance simultaneously. The idea that you could end something from so far away that the person you were ending never heard you at all. She put her hand in her coverall pocket and felt the shape of the ballistic computer. The tape. The cracked casing. She turned it over in her fingers the way she had 1,000 times. If I give you the computer, she said, what happens to it? It becomes evidence. You'd receive it back after the investigation concludes. And if the data matches? Then we can build a case that connects Kane to the incident through ballistic evidence. Combined with the financial records, can you convict him? Mercer was careful. I think we can charge him. Conviction depends on, can you convict him? A pause. Yes, I believe so. Evelyn pulled the computer from her pocket. She set it on the desk between them. The database is organized by date and contract identifier, she said. My uncle used a personal coding system. I can give you the key. She looked at the cracked screen. The data from the last 4 months of entries will be the relevant period. He was active on Kane's file during that time. I know, because he called me twice asking about specific ballistic conditions in locations I didn't recognize, and I helped him run numbers. She looked at Mercer. I've already done part of this analysis myself. I know what the ridge above the North Road looks like. I've measured the angles. If you give me the casing dimensions and the evidence from the crash site, I can narrow the firing position to within 20 meters. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. You're not maintenance. No. What are you? Evelyn looked at the computer on the desk. I'm the person he taught everything to, she said, when there was no one else. They gave her a formal witness assistance designation by 1700, which meant she was now officially something other than the person who swept the range, which she found she had complicated feelings about. She also meant she was no longer staying in the storage room. Mercer arranged temporary quarters in the officer accommodation block, a real room with a real lamp and a window that faced west and caught the last of the afternoon light across the desert. She stood at that window for a while after Mercer left, watching the light change on the ridgeline. The range was empty. The students had been released early. She didn't know what they'd been told, probably some version of administrative hold that told them nothing and communicated everything. The firing line was bare. The flags moved in the evening wind, northeast now, the thermal shift that came every day at this hour when the desert surface cooled faster than the air above it. She had given up the computer. She had given up the one piece of Caleb she'd carried for 14 months, the one object in the world that contained his voice in the closest form it could take without being his voice. His numbers, his calculations, his 20 years of patient observation coded into a database on a device held together with tape. It was the right thing. It was what he would have told her to do. She was still working on believing that. There was a knock at the door. She expected Mercer, maybe Quan. It was Voss. He stood in the doorway without entering, which was the first time she'd seen him hesitate about a threshold in the 6 months she'd been watching him. He looked like a man who had spent the afternoon having his own understanding of events reorganized by someone who knew more than him and who was still processing the indignity of that, even though the reorganization was necessary and he knew it. I have a question, he said. She didn't tell him to come in. She didn't tell him to leave. She waited. On the range today, before the shot. He looked at the floor for a moment, then up. You knew you could make it. Yes. How long have you known you could make that shot? She considered the question. Since the second week I was here, she said. I'd been watching the range long enough to know the conditions. I'd modeled the trajectory. I knew the rifle. She paused. I was waiting for a reason to do it. He looked at her. And I gave you one. You gave me the opening. The reason was already there. He absorbed that. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. Your uncle. He was here, the last time, for a consulting rotation. 6 weeks. He leaned against the doorframe. He was the best I've ever seen on a rifle. I don't say that easily. I've been doing this for 30 years and I've trained some exceptional shooters. He paused. He talked about you. She hadn't expected that. Not specifically, not by name, but there was something he said once. We were running a max distance session, conditions were bad. One of my instructors threw a calculation by maybe 2% and missed clean. Caleb watched it and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, Voss stopped, looked at the window. The ones who can really shoot, you don't find them. They find you when they're ready. He looked back at her. I thought he was being philosophical. Evelyn said nothing. I was talking about you, Voss said. She looked at the empty range, at the flags moving in the evening thermals. He should have said more than that, she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. Voss nodded once. It wasn't agreement with the statement exactly. It was acknowledgement of the weight of it. He straightened from the doorframe. The investigation. Mercer's team. I've given them everything I have for whatever it's worth. He looked at her with something that was neither apology nor its absence, but something in the middle that was probably as close as he could get. I should have pushed harder on the accident inquiry when it happened. I had doubts, and I let them stay doubts. He paused. That's on me. She didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. He knew it wasn't fine. Saying otherwise would be a kindness that neither of them needed. The morning briefing, she said instead. The oscillation cycle. You should run a wind analysis before the 1,000-meter qualification relay this week. The thermal pattern off the canyon has been building for 3 days. It's going to be more pronounced than your forecast shows. Voss blinked. First relay especially, she said. Positions 2 and 3. If you don't account for it, you'll get inconsistent student data, and you won't know if it's the shooter or the conditions. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll take that under advisement, he said. He left. She went back to the window. The light on the ridge was going copper and flat. The coyote was out there again, just at the edge of hearing, moving through the desert with a persistence that didn't distinguish between success and failure. It just kept moving, kept reading the ground, kept looking. Somewhere in a federal evidence lockup being arranged tonight, Caleb's ballistic computer was going to tell its story to people trained to listen to it. And somewhere out there, Victor Kane did not yet know that the woman he had never heard of was the one who was going to bring it. Evelyn turned from the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, an actual bed, not a cot, and put her face in her hands, not crying, not anything close to crying, just letting the day press against the inside of her skull until it settled into something she could carry. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, area code she couldn't place. She stared at the number, called back. It rang twice. Then a voice she didn't know, male, clipped, with the kind of flat effect that came from either training or damage, said, "Ms. Cross, I was told to reach you through this channel." "Who is this?" "My name is Harlan Reed. I'm a former contractor. I worked for Victor Kane for approximately 18 months before I understood what the contracts actually were." A pause. Not hesitation. Preparation. "I was the one who called your uncle. I was the one who warned him." Her hand was very steady on the phone. "He died anyway," she said. "Yes." The voice was quiet. "Because I warned him too late. And because Kane had already put the second contract in place, the one your uncle didn't know about." Another pause. "I've been trying to find the right person to talk to for 14 months. Mercer's team reached out to me through channels 2 days ago, and they told me about you." He paused. "There's something I know that isn't in any file, about the night your uncle died, about who pulled the trigger." His voice was steady, but there was something under it, the sound of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally near the place where he could set it down. "I can give you a name." Evelyn Cross sat in the officer quarters at Redstone Valor, in a room with a real lamp and a window facing west, and held the phone against her ear, and the desert outside went dark, and she said, "Tell me." Harlan Reed's voice had the texture of a man who hadn't slept well in over a year. Not shaky, not broken, just worn at the edges, the way metal wore when it had been under sustained load for longer than it was designed to take. He spoke carefully, with the deliberate pacing of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in his head, and was now finding that the reality of it moved differently than the rehearsal. "His name is Cord Dillon," Reed said, "former Marine Scout sniper. 3 combat deployments, 2 with SOCOM attachments. He separated in 2019 under circumstances that were administratively quiet but not clean. Kane picked him up within 4 months of his separation." Evelyn was standing now. She hadn't decided to stand. Her body had made the decision independently. "Dillon worked 3 contracts for Kane before the Cross job," Reed continued. 2 overseas, 1 domestic. I was logistics on the domestic one. I didn't know what it was at the time. Kane ran compartmentalized operations. Everyone knew their piece and not much else." He paused. "After I found out what we'd actually been facilitating, I started keeping records. Names, dates, operational details I could reconstruct. I contacted your uncle through a cutout, a contact I trusted who knew people in the veteran investigator community. Caleb Cross called me back within 24 hours. "What did you tell him?" "I told him Kane was building a case to move against him. I didn't know it was already in motion. I thought we were talking about a future threat." His voice went quieter. "I thought he had time." Evelyn walked to the window. The desert outside was fully dark now, the ridge line a black edge against a sky going purple-gray. The range lights were on, casting a pale sodium glow over the empty firing line. "Where's Dillon now?" she said. "That's the question Mercer's team has been working." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Last confirmed location was Reno, Nevada, approximately 3 months ago. Financial activity suggests he's still domestic. He's careful. Cash, prepaid, limited digital footprint, but careful has limits." Another pause. "There's something else. Something I didn't tell Mercer's team yet because I needed to verify it first, and because I wasn't certain who I was talking to." "Say it." "Dillon contacted Kane 6 weeks ago. I have a source inside Kane's financial infrastructure, the shell company structure he uses for contract payments. 6 weeks ago, there was an activation payment. Not a completion payment, an activation." Reed let that sit for a moment. Someone put Dylan back in the field. The sodium glow on the range flickered once, wind against the lamp housing. For what target? Evelyn said. I don't know the target. I know the payment amount. It's consistent with a domestic precision contract. He paused. I know the facility identifier and the payment routing. She already knew what he was going to say. It routes to a shell account associated with a logistics vendor contracted to Redstone Valor, Reed said. Miss Cross, I don't know if the target is you or the investigation or someone in this facility who's been talking to Mercer's team. But Dylan is active, and the contract routes here. She stood at the window for a long moment. How current is your source? The payment was confirmed 48 hours ago. Can you send Mercer the documentation? That's why I called. I needed to know who on Mercer's team I could trust with the routing details. I needed to know there was someone inside that facility who could act on it without going through channels that might be compromised. A pause. Your uncle trusted you with his work. I'm extending that trust. She looked at the range, at the empty firing line, at the flags barely moving in the dead calm of the desert night. Send it to Mercer directly, she said. Tonight. Her personal contact, not the investigation line. She gave him the number Mercer had written on the back of a card that afternoon. And Reed. Yes. The casing on the ridge above the North Road. The brass my uncle's computer is going to match. Dylan's the shooter. Reed was quiet. I just need you to tell me if I'm wrong, she said. He didn't tell her she was wrong. She ended the call. She stood in the dark room for a moment, then picked up the facility's internal phone and called Mercer's room number. Mercer answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. By 2200, the conference room had filled back up. Mercer had both agents, a technical analyst who'd arrived in the second vehicle that afternoon, and who set up a laptop that pulled the investigation's current documentation into a single workspace, and Colonel Adrian Hale, who turned out to be the base commander, and who had apparently been briefed on the investigation's existence for some time, and was managing his feelings about that with the disciplined containment of someone who had practiced managing situations they hadn't chosen. Hale was 60, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor service and came out the other side looking like it had been carved rather than lived in. He looked at Evelyn when she came into the room with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Recognition, she thought, but not of her specifically. You look like him, Hale said. Around the eyes. She sat down. Voss was also in the room, at the far end of the table, which put distance between him and everyone else in a way that might have been deliberate, or might have been the geometry of how the chairs were filled. He was watching the technical analyst set up the laptop with his arms crossed, which was the body language of a man who was in a room he felt he belonged in less than he had 24 hours ago and was working out how to reestablish his footing. Mercer pulled the read call information into the briefing with the clean efficiency of someone who was very good at absorbing new intelligence quickly and restructuring an operational picture around it. She laid out what Reed had confirmed: Dylan's identity, the activation payment, the routing to the Redstone Valor logistics vendor. When she finished, the room was quiet. Hale looked at the table. How confident are you in this source? Confident enough to take immediate security measures, Mercer said. The routing detail is specific. The payment timeline is specific. We're treating this as an active threat. To who? Voss said. That's what we're working to determine. Mercer looked at him. The most logical targets are individuals connected to this investigation. Ms. Cross? Yourself. Colonel Hale. She paused. Anyone who's communicated externally about Caleb Cross's death in the last 8 months. That's a short list, Hale said. Yes. Voss looked at Evelyn. You said you'd been here 6 months collecting data. You communicated that externally at any point? My notes were kept on paper. No external communications about the investigation. She paused. I didn't know there was an investigation until this afternoon. But you were building toward one. I was collecting evidence, yes. Did anyone know why you were really here? She looked at Quan. Quan was not in the room, which was its own interesting data point. No one had direct knowledge, she said. I was careful. Voss nodded once. He unfolded his arms. Then the target is most likely someone who went external, someone whose communications Kane could monitor. He looked at Mercer. What about Quan? Mercer glanced at her agent. What about him? He's been the one person on this range who treated Cross as something other than invisible. If Kane has any monitoring on this facility, and we should assume he does given the internal contact who leaked the access code, then anyone who showed specific interest in her might flag. Evelyn looked at Voss with a new kind of attention. Quan called his brother 2 days ago, Voss said. They're close. His brother works private security. He met her eyes. I'm not accusing Quan of anything. I'm saying Kane's infrastructure may be looking for patterns, and an instructor who singles out a maintenance worker the day before federal agents show up at the facility is a pattern. Mercer was writing. Quan doesn't know anything, Evelyn said. Anything, Evelyn said. Kane doesn't know what Quan knows. Kane knows who Quan is and what Quan did. Voss looked at the table. If Dylan is in position, he's going to have done a target assessment. Anyone with a connection to this investigation is a potential liability for Kane right now. Mercer looked at her agent. Get Quan, quietly. Bring him here. Quan arrived, looking like a man who had been asleep for approximately 40 minutes and was not happy about the arithmetic of the situation. He sat down, looked around the table, and said, "What did I do?" in a tone that was too tired to be defensive. "Nothing," Mercer said. "We need to talk about your external communications." He blinked. "My what?" "Your brother, 2 days ago. I called my brother to see if he was coming to my mother's birthday. She's turning 65. He looked at Evelyn. "What is happening?" "We think you may be at risk," Evelyn said. "We think someone may have been monitoring communications from this facility." Quan looked at the room, at Hale, at Mercer, at Voss, and finally back at Evelyn. "Because I talked to you about the wind cycles." "Because you treated me like a person," she said, "and that made you visible." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "What do we do?" What they did for the next 3 hours was build a picture. Mercer's technical analyst pulled the facility's external communication logs, a process that required Hale's authorization, which he gave without hesitation, and began mapping contact patterns from the past 8 months. Reed sent the routing documentation to Mercer's secure line at 2247, and the analyst cross-referenced the shell company identifiers against the facility's vendor contracts in a process that was methodical and slow and absolutely confirmed what Reed had said. The activation payment had routed through a logistics vendor with active contracts to Redstone Valor's fuel and maintenance supply chain. Someone with access to the vendor relationship had a financial connection to Kane's operation. The vendor's facility contact was a supply coordinator named Bertram Sloan, who had, as Mercer had mentioned that afternoon, separated from the facility 8 months ago. His personnel file listed a forwarding address in Phoenix that had turned out to be a UPS store. His phone number disconnected within a week of his separation. His last known vehicle had been sold at a Phoenix auction 6 months ago for cash. Sloan was gone, but the vendor contract remained active, which was an administrative oversight nobody had caught, which meant the financial routing still functioned. "Kane doesn't need Sloan anymore," Mercer said, at approximately midnight. "The channel is open. He's using the existing infrastructure." "He's using a dead drop," Voss said. "He activated Dylan through a channel that looks like a facility payment because it is a facility payment pathway, just with an extra routing step." He looked at the analyst's screen. "Can we use that?" "Use it how?" Mercer said. "If the channel is open and Kane is using it, it goes both ways. Can we push something through it that makes Dylan think the contract conditions have changed?" Mercer looked at him. "You're talking about a deception operation." "I'm talking about making a shooter question his target parameters." Voss's voice was flat and specific. "If Dylan is good, and if Kane hired him, he's good, he will verify before he takes a shot. Give him something to verify that takes him out of position." "That requires us to know his position," Evelyn said. "Yes." Voss looked at her. "Which is why I want you on the ridge at first light." The room went quiet. "You know this terrain," Voss said. "You've been studying it for 6 months. You've been reading the wind patterns, the approach angles, the sight lines. If Dylan has set up an overwatch position on or near this facility, you have a better chance of finding it than anyone I have." He paused. "I have people I trust who can go with you, former recon. They know how to move." "I'm a maintenance technician," she said. "You made a 3,147-meter shot this morning," he said. "Don't do that." She looked at Hale. Hale looked at Mercer. It's not an operation, Mercer said. We're not sending civilians into... I'm not asking her to engage, Voss said. I'm asking her to read terrain. She reads terrain. That's what she does. He looked back at Evelyn. You've walked the perimeter. You know the high ground. She thought about the north access road in the dark. The angles she'd measured from the ridge above it. The way the terrain formed natural concealment in two specific positions that a trained shooter would identify within the first hour of an area reconnaissance. The southwest spur off Blackstone Ridge, she said, and the elevated draw on the eastern canyon wall, approximately 600 meters north of the main gate. She paused. Those are the two overwatch positions with clean sightlines to the facility and to the north road. If Dylan did a proper area recce, he's already been to both. Voss looked at her steadily. Which one would you use? She didn't hesitate. The draw. Better concealment, better egress, and the prevailing wind gives you a thermal signature advantage in the early morning. The spur is the obvious choice, which means a good shooter avoids it. Voss looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Evelyn. You'd be going to identify a position, not engage it. If there's any sign of occupation, you come back. Yes. And you go with two of my people, not Voss's people, mine. Yes. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before. It wasn't quite a question. Evelyn didn't quite answer it. My uncle spent 15 years teaching me things that weren't on any curriculum, she said. Some of it was at a desk. Most of it wasn't. Mercer closed her folder. First light is 0532. Be ready at 0445. She slept for 3 hours. Not well, but functionally. The kind of sleep that was less about rest and more about system maintenance, keeping the machinery from degrading below operational threshold. She was at the equipment staging area at 0440, 5 minutes early. Mercer's two agents, a woman named Delacroix and a man named Park, were already there, kitted in the kind of subdued field gear that wasn't military issue but was clearly not purchased from a sporting goods store either. Delacroix was 40, lean, with the patient stillness of someone who spent a lot of time waiting in small spaces. Park was younger, mid-30s, moved with the quiet efficiency of a person who had trained the excess out of himself. Neither of them said anything about her coveralls. She'd pulled them on out of habit and only now registered they were the wrong choice. Delacroix handed her a jacket without being asked. Tan, lightweight, broken pattern. The right choice. You lead the route, Delacroix said. We cover your flanks. I know. If you see anything, I know. She pulled the jacket on. I'll point. You decide. Delacroix nodded. They went out the north gate at 0452 into the pre-dawn dark. The desert was cold at this hour, 41 degrees dropping. And the sky was the deep gray of an hour before first light, when shapes existed but colors didn't. Evelyn moved without a flashlight, which Park noticed and followed her lead on. The draw was approximately 1.4 kilometers from the north gate, up and east across terrain that was manageable but not easy. Loose shale on the lower slopes, then a band of harder rock, then the drainage channel that the draw followed up into the canyon wall. She'd walked this approach twice in daylight, checking fence lines and boundary markers. She knew where the shale ran slippery and where it held. They didn't talk. 50 meters from the draw entrance, she stopped. Delacroix came up beside her. Evelyn pointed at the ground without speaking. 12 inches from her right boot, in the dirt at the edge of the shale transition, was an impression. Not a full boot print, more a partial pressure mark on the compacted soil, the leading edge of someone's footfall. Fresh enough that the dew that had settled on the surrounding ground hadn't formed inside the depression. Someone had been here within the last 4 hours. Park crouched and looked at it. Looked up at her. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed up the draw. He understood. He moved off her left. Delacroix took her right. They went up the draw slowly. The draw ran approximately 200 meters before it opened onto a natural shelf in the canyon wall. A flat area of rock maybe 8 meters across, backed by a fractured stone face that provided cover from 3 directions and a sightline looking southwest toward the facility and northwest along the line of the north access road. In daylight, from this position, you could see the facility's main gate, the range control building, the officer accommodation block, and a full kilometer of the north road. In daylight, from this position, you could see everything. The shelf was empty, but it had not been empty recently. She saw it before she stepped onto the rock surface, the subtle compaction of the grit and dust that blew into sheltered areas. Disturbed in a rectangle approximately 2 meters by 1 meter at the left edge of the shelf, where the natural rock formation provided the best rest for a long gun and the best cover for a prone body. The disturbed area was consistent with someone having lain in that position for an extended period. At the far edge of the disturbance, almost against the rock wall, she found where the grit had been smoothed and then resettled. Someone had cleared a small area, probably for equipment, a bipod, a ranging device, something. No brass, no packaging, no debris of any kind. A professional position, occupied and then sanitized. She crouched at the position, looked southwest toward the facility. From here, the range control building was clearly visible. The officer accommodation block was visible. The north gate was visible. From here, the window of the room she'd slept in 3 hours ago was visible. She stood up very carefully. Delacroix was beside her. "He's been here." "Yes." "When do you think—" "Overnight," Evelyn said. "He was here during darkness. He did his area recce, he confirmed the position, and he pulled out before first light." She looked at the sight lines. "He'll come back." "When?" She looked at the sky. The gray was beginning to separate into layers now, the deep black above thinning at the eastern edge. "He'll want light," she said. "A shooter at this distance needs to see his target clearly. He'll want to be in position before first light and acquire during the transition." She looked at the facility. "He wasn't here tonight to shoot. He was here to confirm." "Tonight," Park said from behind her. "Tonight," she agreed. "Or tomorrow morning at the latest, whenever the target presents." "Then we set up," Delacroix said. "Surveillance on the position, motion sensors on the approach." "Yes." Evelyn looked at the draw below them. The light was coming. She needed to be back at the facility before it was bright enough to be visible from the position they were standing in. Because if Dylan was watching his approach route from a secondary position, which any careful shooter would do, he would see them leaving the draw and know the position was burned. "Move now," she said, fast and low. They went back down the draw in 3 minutes. At year 620, Mercer had a surveillance plan. Motion sensors on the draw approach at 3 points, a camera unit with thermal capability positioned on the spur to cover the draw shelf, and a response protocol that had Delacroix and Park as the primary response element with federal backup holding at the north gate. Evelyn sat in the conference room and looked at the facility map and thought about Dylan. She didn't know his face. She had a name and a service record summary that Mercer's analyst had pulled. Marine Scout Sniper, 3 tours, SOCOM attachment in a theater she'd have to read carefully between the lines to identify. The photograph in his service record showed a man in his late 30s with a neutral expression and the kind of eyes that didn't give information freely. She'd seen eyes like that before. In the mirror. Voss came in at 0630 with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking. "Talk to me about the position," he said. She described it. The shelf geometry, the sight lines, the disturbance pattern. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's good." "Yes." "How good?" "The position is clean. The approach route is the least obvious of the 3 viable routes to that shelf, which means he did a full area recce before he committed. He sanitized the position completely." She looked at the coffee. "Good enough to be a problem." "Can you match him?" She looked up. Voss met her eyes. "If it comes to it, if the response element can't get there in time, and the situation requires someone to counter from range." He was watching her with the steady attention he'd been watching her with since the shot on the range. "I need to know the answer to that question now, not in the middle of a situation. You're asking if I can take a counter-sniper shot." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What's your response element's transit time from the north gate to that shelf?" 4 minutes minimum, probably 6. A shooter in position fires and moves in under 60 seconds. If he's targeting someone at the facility and your element is at the gate, they're not going to make it." She looked at the map. "You need a counter position." "Yes." "The southwest spur," she said. "The obvious position, which means Dylan has already assessed it and discounted it, which means he's not watching it closely." She looked at the sight lines on the map. From the spur, the draw shelf is visible at approximately 800 meters. Variable wind, but manageable. It's a shorter shot than this morning. Voss looked at the map, looked at her. If I put you on that spur with a rifle, you're not putting me anywhere, she said. I'm telling you the geometry. She paused. If the situation requires a countershot, the spur is the position. That's the answer to your question. He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his coffee. You want me to ask you directly? I want you to understand what you're asking. I understand what I'm asking. She looked at the map, at the draw, at the spur, at the distance between them. My uncle spent 2 years building a case against the man who eventually had him killed, she said. He did it right. He went through proper channels. He trusted the process. She looked at Voss. I'm not here for a shot. I'm here for a conviction. I want Dylan in a courtroom. I want Kane in a courtroom. She held his eyes. But if Dylan puts someone at risk in that facility, I will do what needs doing and sort out the rest afterward. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he'd nodded the night before, acknowledging weight rather than expressing agreement. The spur, he said, if it comes to that. The spur, she said. It came to that at 0312 the following morning. The motion sensor on the draw approach fired at 0308, Delacroix's radio crackling. Evelyn awake from a sleep so light it barely qualified. By the time Evelyn had her boots on, the thermal camera on the spur had confirmed a heat signature moving up the draw with the slow practiced patience of someone who had done this before and was in no hurry because hurry was the enemy. Mercer was on the radio. Response element is moving to the gate. 4 minutes. Evelyn was already in the hallway. Voss was there. He had a rifle case in one hand and was holding it out to her before she'd taken 3 steps. Spur access is through the maintenance yard, he said. I'll take the west approach to create a secondary signature on his thermal if he's monitoring. She took the case. Cross. He said it the way he'd said her name the first time on the range, like he was placing a piece. But different now. Like the piece had a weight he hadn't accounted for. Whatever you see up there, I know, she said. Bring him back alive if you can. I know, she said again. She went. The night was cold and completely still, no wind. The stars were hard and clear, the kind of sky that existed in the desert because there was nothing between it and you. She crossed the maintenance yard in 30 seconds and hit the perimeter at the fence gap she'd found 2 months ago and used twice for her own night surveys. The spur was a 7-minute move in daylight. She made it in 4, in the dark, because she knew every step of the route and because she was motivated in the particular focused way that had no name except urgency, without panic. She set up in the position at 0317. The draw shelf was 800 meters northeast. Through the rifle's night-capable scope, Voss had thought about that, had put the right equipment in the case. It was a gray-green landscape of rock and shadow. The thermal showed nothing on the shelf yet. She settled in, controlled her breathing. Let the scope picture steady. The facility below was visible, the range control building, the accommodation block, the north gate where Delacroix and Park were holding. The gate lights made them slightly visible against the dark, which was tactically imperfect but unavoidable. At 0321, the thermal scope picked up the heat signature cresting the draw. He was good. He moved to the shelf in a low crawl that minimized his profile. He settled into position, the same position Evelyn had crouched over 12 hours ago, with the practiced economy of someone depositing himself into a shape he'd already memorized. Within 90 seconds of reaching the shelf, he was still. She had him in her scope. 800 meters, no wind, clear air. Through the scope, she could see enough. The outline of a long weapon on a bipod. The suppressor. The body of a man who was looking at the facility the way she was looking at him. She got on his radio. I have eyes on. He's in position. He's not shooting yet. He's acquiring. Mercer's voice, flat. Response element is 2 minutes out. He'll hear them on the approach. Can you hold him? She looked at the figure on the shelf. He was settling deeper into his position. His weapon was tracking something at the facility. She followed the angle, the accommodation block, the specific window, Hale's room. He's tracking the colonel's window, she said. Silence on the radio for 2 seconds. Response element, double time, Mercer said. Evelyn watched Dylan on the shelf. I was fully settled now, completely still. The stillness of a man at the end of a long process, at the moment where everything became simple. She knew that stillness. She understood it from the inside. She put her reticle center mass and held it there, and did not squeeze because Voss had said, "Bring him back alive if you can," and she was going to honor that for as long as she could honor it. 1 minute. She watched him breathe, watched his body do the small adjustments that a shooter makes before the trigger press, the settling, the finding of the natural respiratory pause. He was 45 seconds from firing. She keyed the radio. 30 seconds. Element is on the draw approach. He'll hear them. Dylan's head moved, slightly, instinctively, the way a person turned toward a sound they weren't supposed to hear. He'd heard something. She watched him make the calculation, the shooter's calculation, the one that happened in under 2 seconds and ended in one of two decisions: stay and fire fast, or go. He began to move. He's breaking position, she said. He's going to run. Hold him, Mercer said. Evelyn Cross had Cord Dillon in her scope at 800 meters in the dark desert night, and she thought about her uncle's rifle sitting on Voss's briefing bench like it had no history. And she thought about a single .338 casing on a ridge above a road. And she thought about what Caleb had looked like in the photograph, squinting into the light, looking like he was home. She adjusted 3 inches right. Exhaled. She shot Dillon in the right thigh. The figure on the shelf dropped. Not fell. Dropped. The way a body dropped when it was controlled by a person who was trying not to drop, but couldn't help it. I went down behind his weapon and didn't get back up. She was on the radio before the sound of the shot had finished rolling across the canyon. He's down. Right leg. He's alive. Element move now. He's got 60 seconds before he recovers enough to try to crawl. Delacroix's voice. On it. She held the position and watched through the scope as Dillon tried to move on the shelf. Tried and couldn't because the thigh wound was doing what it needed to do without being what she hadn't wanted it to be. And watched the thermal signatures of the response element coming up the draw faster than 4 minutes, faster than they'd thought. And she held the position and breathed and watched them reach the shelf and take Cord Dillon into custody at 0329. Then she put her face against the cool stock of the rifle and let out a breath that had been waiting a long time to leave. The desert was quiet. The stars were still there. Somewhere down the canyon, the coyote was working its territory with the same patience it always had, moving through the dark without needing it to be anything other than dark. She stayed on the spur until she was certain there was nothing else moving in the terrain around the draw. Then she packed the case and came down the way she'd gone up and walked back through the maintenance yard in the first gray light of a morning that felt different from every morning that had come before it, though the desert looked the same and the wind was doing what it always did, and the flags on the range were moving in the early thermal the way they moved every single day. Mercer was at the north gate. He's alive, Mercer said. He's talking. He'll trade Kane for a deal, Evelyn said. Yes. Let him. Mercer looked at her for a moment. That was a very specific shot. Yes. At 800 meters in the dark. Yes. Mercer looked like she had more to say about that and decided, for now, not to say it. Go inside, there's coffee. Evelyn went inside. She sat at the table in the conference room with the coffee and the facility map she'd been staring at for 16 hours, and she thought about Cord Dillon on a shelf above a road 14 months ago with a .338 Lapua and a clean sight line to her uncle's vehicle, and she thought about the shot he had taken, and she thought about the shot she had taken, and she thought that the distance between those two shots, not in meters, but in everything else, was the distance she'd spent her whole life learning to understand. Caleb had understood it. She was still working on it. But she was here, and Dillon was in custody, and Kane's name was in a federal file with enough documentation attached to it that even careful lawyers were going to have trouble finding the gaps. It wasn't finished, but it was close enough to something that she could feel the shape of it. She drank the coffee. She looked at the map. Outside, the desert turned from gray to gold, the way it did every morning, indifferent and exact. The debrief started at 0900, and nobody in the room was pretending it was routine. Mercer had brought in a fourth agent overnight, a man named Caswell, senior enough that the other three adjusted their posture when he walked in, which told Evelyn something about the weight of what was being assembled. Caswell was 50-ish, unremarkable in the way that people who were very good at their work sometimes became unremarkable. With reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and a legal pad he wrote on in handwriting, so small it looked like circuitry. Cord Dillon was in the facility's medical room with a field dressing on his thigh and a federal agent sitting in a chair by the door. The wound was clean. She'd known it would be because she'd made it that way, hitting the lateral compartment and avoiding the femoral with the same precision she'd applied to everything else on this range. But it was painful enough that he wasn't going anywhere and wasn't inclined to be difficult about the conversation Mercer's team wanted to have. He'd asked for a lawyer at 0415. By 0700, he'd withdrawn the request and started talking, which told her the lawyer calculation had resolved quickly in favor of cooperation. Mercer had said he'd trade Kane for a deal. He was trading. Evelyn knew none of the details of that conversation. She'd been told to wait. She was not good at waiting, which was an irony given what she did for a living. She sat in the hallway outside the conference room on a chair that was slightly too low for the wall height, which made the posture wrong, and she thought about the shot. 800 meters in the dark. Right thigh, lateral compartment. The shot had gone exactly where she'd put it, which was the way it was supposed to work and usually did when you did your part correctly. But there was always a moment afterward where you ran the variables you couldn't control. Wind, target movement in the last quarter second, a density-altitude shift you hadn't accounted for, and understood that the distance between the shot going where you put it and the shot going somewhere else was smaller than people who didn't shoot like to think. She'd been close to that line before. She was always aware of it. Dillon was alive. That was what she'd chosen and what she'd executed. The rest of it was bookkeeping. The door opened at 0857 and Caswell leaned out. "Miss Cross, come in." The room was fuller than it had been at midnight. Hale was there, and Voss, and Mercer, and her 3 agents, and Caswell, and a woman Evelyn didn't recognize who turned out to be from the federal prosecutor's office, and who had driven through the night from Salt Lake City and looked like it. There was a whiteboard on the wall that someone had written on in the last hour. Names and dates and connection lines in marker. Kane's name was at the top. Dillon's below it, connected by a line with a dollar amount. Below Dillon, the name Bertram Sloan with a question mark. Below Sloan, Redstone Valor, and below that, in handwriting she recognized as Caswell's, the name Caleb Cross with a date. 14 months ago. She looked at the whiteboard. Then she sat down. "Ms. Cross," Caswell set his reading glasses on the table. "I want to walk through what we have and what we need, and I want your input on the parts where your knowledge is relevant." He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had been told about the previous 36 hours and was still calibrating what he was dealing with. "You've been building a parallel investigation for 6 months. Some of what you've gathered overlaps with what we have. Some of it doesn't. I'd like to understand the full picture before we go any further with Dillon." "What did Dillon give you?" she said. Caswell looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Evelyn. "He confirmed Kane contracted the Cross operation. He confirmed the operational details. The access code, the vehicle, the firing position above the North Road." She paused. "He confirmed the shot. He's willing to testify to all of it." "In exchange for what?" "Reduced sentencing on the domestic contract. He's looking at federal attempted murder charges on top of the contracted killing. If we stack everything, he's never leaving a federal facility. The deal puts the clock at 15 years with possibility of parole in exchange for full cooperation on Kane." Evelyn looked at the whiteboard, at Caleb's name. 15 years, she said. "Ms. Cross, I understand the math." She said it flat. "What do you need from me?" Caswell picked up his legal pad. "The ballistic computer. Your uncle's database. Dillon's confession corroborates the method, but the physical evidence connecting Kane's operation to the Cross shooting is still circumstantial without the trajectory match. If the database contains data from Kane's prior contracts that establishes a consistent operational signature." "It does," she said. "I've been through most of it. There are 7 contract identifiers in my uncle's database that I couldn't match to publicly known operations. 3 of them have ballistic profiles consistent with the .338 La Pua at distances between 800 and 1,200 meters. 2 of those have wind drift calculations that put the firing position in terrain consistent with elevated eastern approach geometry." She paused. "Which is exactly what the draw shelf is." The prosecutor leaned forward. "You've already run this analysis." "I had 6 months. Can you walk us through it?" "Yes." Caswell looked at her for a moment. The reading glasses went back on. He wrote something. I also want to understand your presence here, your background. For the purposes of the investigation's integrity, I need to know who you are and why your evidence is credible. Evelyn looked around the table. Voss was watching her. Hale was watching her. Quan, she noticed, had been added to the room at some point and was sitting against the wall rather than at the table, which she thought was either thoughtful or deliberate, and probably both. My uncle recruited me informally starting when I was 11, she said. He was systematic about it, the way he was systematic about everything. Marksmanship first, environmental reading, then field mathematics, ballistics, trajectory modeling. When I was in my mid-20s, I was shooting at distances that most people in formal programs don't reach. She kept her voice level. I also spent 3 years working for a private security firm that did risk assessment for corporate clients operating in elevated threat environments. Threat analysis, route security, site surveys. I left that work 4 years ago. She looked at Caswell. I have no law enforcement credentials. My evidence is credible because I documented my methods, my sources, and my chain of custody on everything I collected while I was here. You can verify every step. The firm, Caswell said. Name. Meridian Risk Group, based in Denver. My supervisor was a retired federal agent named Carol Ban. She paused. She can confirm my training and my methodology. She won't enjoy the call, but she'll confirm it. Caswell wrote the name. Why did you leave? She looked at the whiteboard. My uncle called me and told me he thought he was being watched. 2 months later, he was dead. She let that sit. I needed to be somewhere else, and I needed to do what I came here to do. The room was quiet for a moment. Hale cleared his throat. It was the first sound he'd made since she'd sat down. The firm, Meridian. Were you doing field work there or desk work? Field work, sir. What kind of field work? She met his eyes. I wasn't hostile. He was doing the same calibration Caswell was doing, assembling a picture of what she actually was, so he could make decisions based on something other than guesswork. Site security surveys, primarily. Elevated positions, sightline analysis, approach route assessment, identifying where a threat would come from before it came from there. She paused. The same thing I did on this facility for 6 months. The same thing I did last night. Hale looked at the table. He looked like a man who was reassessing a series of decisions he'd made based on incomplete information and was not particularly comfortable with what the reassessment showed him. You've been inside my facility for 6 months, he said, with a parallel investigation running, with documents I didn't know were being collected. He looked up. And nobody here noticed. I was maintenance, she said. Nobody notices maintenance. I noticed, Quan said from the wall. You noticed the wind analysis, she said. You didn't connect it to anything else. Quan opened his mouth and closed it, which was fair. Voss was still watching her. He hadn't said anything yet, and she'd been aware of that, the way you were aware of something that wasn't making noise when it should be. Commander Voss, Caswell said, you've been cooperating with this investigation for 6 weeks. In that time, did you have any knowledge of Ms. Cross's presence here as anything other than support staff? No, Voss said. Did anything about her behavior suggest? No. He said it without qualification, which was more honest than she'd expected. She was good. She stayed in role. She was thorough enough that I never had a reason to look twice. He paused. Until the shot. The shot, Caswell said. Voss looked at Evelyn. I set up what I intended as a humiliation, he said. I gave her a rifle I recognized and a target I knew was outside reasonable range, in front of a group of people who were going to watch her fail. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who was not looking to excuse the thing they were saying. She hit it. Center. First round. Caswell looked at Evelyn. What was the distance? 3,947 meters, she said. Approximately. We didn't have a precise laser measurement on the target position. Caswell put his pen down, picked it up. That's not a standard training distance. No. Is that distance achievable? I achieved it. The prosecutor was looking at her with an expression that suggested she was recalculating something. And last night, 800 meters, in darkness, deliberate wounding shot. Yes. With what confidence of outcome? She thought about that honestly. 90+% for the hit. The specific placement, maybe 85. The conditions were good. No wind, clear air. The scope was appropriate for the light level. She paused. I've made harder shots. Where? She looked at Caswell. In training. He wrote something. She didn't ask what. The full debrief ran until 1300. She walked them through the 6 months of documentation, the maintenance logs with the timing inconsistencies, the medical response records, the vehicle inspection sign-off, the communication patterns she'd observed between facility personnel and the logistics vendor. She walked them through her ballistic analysis of the draw shelf position, the angles, the measurements she'd taken by hand on her night surveys. She walked them through her uncle's database coding system, the contract identifiers, the 3 profiles she believed matched Kane's operational signature. The prosecutor took 12 pages of notes. Caswell took more. At 12:47, Mercer looked at the table and said, "I think we have enough." And the room exhaled in a collective way that told Evelyn everyone had been working against something. Deadline, doubt, the weight of what they were trying to build, and now felt the ground solidify slightly under them. Not finished, but enough. She was walking out of the conference room when Voss caught up with her in the hallway. "Cross." She stopped. He came up beside her, and they walked for a few steps before he said what he was going to say, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who needed movement to find words. "The shot you made on the range yesterday," he said. "I want to be direct about something." "All right." "I set that up to be a public failure. I've been doing this long enough to know what I was doing." He said it the way he'd said it in the conference room, not looking for absolution, just stating facts. "I knew that rifle was Caleb's. I didn't connect the name when you said Cross. I should have. That's on me." He paused. "But the shot itself. What you did, that's not something I've seen in 30 years of this work." She kept walking. "What do you want me to say to that?" "Nothing," he said. "I just want you to know I saw it. Not the spectacle of it, the actual execution." He looked at the wall. "Your uncle was the best I've ever trained under. You're better than he was." She stopped walking. She hadn't expected that. The thing about Caleb, the thing she'd lived with for 34 years, and particularly for the last 14 months, was that he had always been the ceiling, the standard, the thing you measured yourself against and found the gap and kept working. He'd been the best she'd ever seen, and she'd been trained by him, and the measure of how good she was had always been defined by the distance between herself and him. "Don't do that," she said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm telling you what I observed." He was... She stopped, started again. "He taught me everything I know." "I know he did." Voss looked at her. "That's what I'm saying. He taught you everything he knew, and then you went further." He paused. He'd have wanted to know that. She looked at the hallway wall, at the facility map she'd been staring at for weeks, at the range visible through the end window, the empty line, the flags in the midday wind, the ridge where she'd come down this morning in the early gray light with a rifle case, and a very specific feeling she was still working out how to name. "He knew," she said, and then surprised herself by believing it. Voss nodded. He put his hands in his pockets, which was the most casual she'd ever seen him. "The program," he said. "The advanced precision course. I'm going to have a gap in my instructor cadre for the next rotation. Pratt is leaving, his contract is up, and honestly, he should have left 2 rotations ago." He looked at the range. "I need someone who can teach long-range environmental reading, wind analysis, thermal pattern recognition, the stuff that most programs underweight because the instructors don't have the patience for it." She looked at him. "I'm not offering you anything," he said. "I'm telling you there's a gap." "You're asking if I want a job." "I'm telling you there's a gap," he said again. "What you do with that information is your business." He walked back toward the conference room. She stood in the hallway and looked at the range for a long time. Victor Kane was arrested at 1640 that afternoon at a hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he had apparently been for the past 10 days under a name that wasn't his, in a room that contained 2 laptops, a burner phone infrastructure that Mercer's technical team described as sophisticated, and a go bag that suggested he'd been planning to move soon. Mercer called Evelyn at 16:43 to tell her. The call was 11 seconds long. Evelyn sat on the bed in the officer quarters and held the phone after the call ended and felt the thing she'd expected to feel. The completeness of it, the closing of a circuit that had been open for 14 months, and found it was more complicated than she'd prepared for, which was probably something she should have anticipated, but hadn't. She'd thought about this moment a lot. She'd constructed versions of it during the 6 months she'd been here, during the nights when she couldn't sleep, and the maintenance work felt endless, and the investigation was a slow accumulation of small pieces that didn't yet make a shape. She'd thought about how it would feel. The shape it made was smaller than she'd expected and heavier than she'd expected, and those two things together made something she didn't have a word for. She put the phone down. She picked it back up. She called a number she had memorized because Caleb had always said you should memorize the numbers that mattered. A woman named Ruth in Billings, Montana, who had been her uncle's closest friend for 20 years, and who had called Evelyn 7 times in the 14 months since his death, and whom Evelyn had not called back enough. Ruth answered on the 3rd ring. Evelyn. They got him, she said. Kane, they arrested him this afternoon. A long silence. And the one who, in federal custody, he's cooperating. She paused. It's going to go to trial. It's going to take time. But they have enough. Another silence. She heard Ruth breathe, and heard the particular sound of breathing that wasn't crying but was adjacent to it. Caleb would have, Ruth started, stopped. I know, Evelyn said. He would have had something funny to say about all of this. You know how he was, some completely inappropriate. I know, she said again, and almost laughed, because she did know, because she could hear exactly what Caleb would have said, and it would have been completely wrong for the moment and exactly right for her. She talked to Ruth for 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd talked to almost anyone in the last year. Ruth asked if she was coming home. Evelyn said she didn't know yet. Ruth said to come home, which was advice she'd been giving for 14 months. Evelyn said she'd think about it, which was not a promise but was more honest than the deflection she'd been using. After the call, she sat for a while in the room that had a real lamp and a window facing west, and thought about Montana, about the property Caleb had left her, which she hadn't visited since his death because she hadn't been able to figure out how to be there without him, about the range he'd built on the back of that property, 40 acres of open ground with natural windbreaks at the 500 and 1200 meter marks, and a ridge at the far end that put a natural 800-meter shot available to anyone willing to hike to the firing position. He'd built it for her. She'd known that. He'd never said it directly, but she'd known it. She'd been somewhere else every time she'd thought about going back. At 800, she went to the range. Not for any operational reason, just because it was where she went. It was where she'd been going every morning for 6 months, and the habit of it was stronger than the context, and she wasn't yet ready to be in a room with 4 walls and no particular view. The range was empty. The evening wind was doing its thing, the thermal reversal she'd described to Quan on her second day, the one he'd never quite believed until she'd been right about it 3 sessions in a row. The flags at 500 meters were moving northeast. The flags at 1,000 had dropped to near stillness. The flags at 2,000 were invisible at this hour. She walked the firing line. Old habit. She found a casing near the drainage channel that had been missed during afternoon cleanup, and picked it up and put it in her pocket, which was so deeply automatic she only noticed she'd done it after the fact. She stood at the position where she'd lain behind her uncle's rifle 36 hours ago and looked at Blackstone Ridge. The target frame was still up there. She could barely see it from here in the failing light, a small pale rectangle against the darker rock. In her scope yesterday it had looked like a coin. From here it looked like nothing, like a mark someone had made on a landscape too large to be marked. You eat anything today? She turned. Quan was coming down the firing line with 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper, the kind that came from the facility mess when you were too late for regular meal service and they gave you whatever was left. She took the sandwich. Thank you. He stood beside her and looked at the ridge. That frame needs to come down. I'll send someone tomorrow. I'll get it, she said. You don't have to. He stopped. Right, of course you will. She unwrapped the sandwich. It was turkey, which she didn't particularly like, and she ate it anyway. What happens to you now? Quan said. Investigation continues. I'll probably testify. Eventually. She looked at the ridge. Apart from that, I don't know. Voss mentioned there's an instructor gap. He mentioned it to me too. You'd be good at it. Quan looked at her sideways. The students would hate you for about a week, and then they wouldn't be able to imagine not having you here. That's optimistic. The shot you made yesterday, they're still talking about it. Pratt hasn't said anything since, which is the best outcome any of us could have hoped for. He looked at the range. Reyes asked me this morning if you'd teach the 2,000-meter environmental reading module. She didn't know if she should ask directly. She should ask directly. That's what I said. He paused. Are you going to take the gap? She looked at the range, at the wind indicators, at the ridge where the target frame was still visible, just barely, in the last of the light. I don't know, she said, and it was the honest answer, which was something she was still working out how to give with any regularity. Quan nodded. He finished his sandwich. He stood there another minute, not filling the quiet with anything, which she appreciated more than she expected to. The oscillation cycle this morning, he said eventually. You called it within 40 seconds yesterday. I timed it. 43. I checked your numbers afterward. You've been logging the pattern for 5 months. 5 months. He shook his head. You were doing that the whole time. I was doing a lot of things the whole time. He looked at her. I'm glad you were here. He said it simply, without the weight that would have made it into something else. For what it's worth, whatever you decide. She looked at the ridge. The light was almost gone. The target frame had disappeared into the dark, indistinguishable from the rock around it. Just another mark on something too large for marks. Tomorrow she'd go up and take it down. She'd walk the same approach she'd been walking for 6 months, past the 500, the 1,000, the long sight line of the 2,000. And she'd retrieve a piece of cardboard from a distance that had seemed theoretical until it wasn't, and she'd carry it back down, and the range would be clean. And then she'd have to figure out what came after that. She finished the sandwich. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket, same pocket as the casing. Tell Reyes I'll run the environmental module, she said. Thursday, 0700. She should bring her dope book and plan to redo her wind charts from scratch. Quan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and was better for it. She's going to be there at 0630. I know, Evelyn said. So will I. She looked at the ridge one more time. Then she walked off the firing line and through the range gate and back toward the lights of the facility, where 2 federal investigations were being assembled into something that would eventually become a trial, and where a man named Cord Dillon was in a medical room deciding what his cooperation was worth, and where the rifle that had belonged to her uncle was in an evidence locker waiting for the legal process to determine what it meant and who it belonged to. The desert was dark and cold and completely itself, the way it always was. And the coyote was out there in the middle of it, and she thought about Montana, about 40 acres of open ground, and a ridge at the far end with 800 meters of clear air between it and the firing position Caleb had built with his own hands. She thought she might go back to see it. Not yet, but soon. Thursday came in cold and clear, the kind of morning that made the desert look like it had been rinsed overnight and set out to dry. Evelyn was on the range at 0615. Reyes was already there at 0622, which was 8 minutes earlier than Evelyn had predicted, and confirmed what she'd suspected about the sergeant's disposition toward work. Reyes had her dope book, 2 pens, a fresh wind chart form, and the particular focused energy of someone who had been awake since before the alarm and had channeled that into preparation rather than anxiety. 2 other students showed up by 0645 without being invited, a federal agent named Torres, who'd been in the back of the cohort all week, quiet and observant, and a young Army corporal named Bashi who'd been struggling with his 1,000-meter consistency and had apparently decided the struggle was rooted in something Evelyn could fix. She hadn't told either of them to come. She didn't tell them to leave. By 0700, there were 5 people on the line, including Quan, who showed up with coffee and the elaborately casual posture of someone who was absolutely there for professional observation purposes, and not at all because he wanted to see how this went. She didn't use notes. She didn't use slides. She walked to the center of the firing line and looked at the assembled group and said, "Tell me what the wind is doing." Reyes looked at the flags. Northwest, 7 to 9 knots, the 500 indicator. 1,000 is lighter, maybe 4. Why is it lighter at 1,000? The terrain, the berm at 800 creates a wind shadow. Partially. What else? Reyes looked at the range, looked at the canyon wall to the east. The thermal is still building. The cold air off the canyon hasn't mixed yet with the surface air. When will it mix? Hour, maybe 90 minutes. And when it does? The 1,000 indicator will increase. The 500 might drop. Might, Evelyn said. Why might? Because the surface air is moving northwest and the thermal is going to come off the east wall, so depending on which is stronger, they'll interact, Evelyn said. They don't replace each other. They compete. For about 11 minutes, you're going to have two different wind columns running simultaneously in the same corridor, and your bullet is going to pass through both of them, and your firing solution is going to be wrong for at least one. She looked at the group. This is why you don't shoot in that window. This is why you wait, or you shoot before it starts. She paused. Your dope book tells you what the bullet does. The terrain tells you what the wind does. If you only read one of those, you're guessing. Torres raised his hand. How do you know when the thermal starts? The mirage in your scope changes direction, she said. It goes from a slow left-to-right boil to a more vertical shimmer. Takes practice to see it. You'll miss it the first 20 times. She looked at him. So start looking for it today. That was how the morning went. Not a lecture, not a demonstration. A conversation between people who were looking at the same piece of ground and trying to understand different parts of it. And Evelyn was the one who'd been looking longest and had the most to say. At 0920, Reyes hit a 1,500-meter target after 3 misses and a wind chart correction that she'd calculated herself. And the sound she made was not triumphant. It was quiet, internal, the sound of someone who had just understood something and was absorbing it rather than celebrating it. Evelyn watched her and thought about the first time she'd done something similar. At 17, on a piece of ground in eastern Montana, with her uncle standing 6 feet behind her, saying nothing at all, just letting the thing be what it was. She didn't say anything either. The weeks that followed were not simple. Federal investigations were not designed for simplicity. They were designed for thoroughness, which meant they moved at the pace of documentation and legal review and interagency coordination, all of which operated on a timeline that had nothing to do with what any individual in the situation needed, emotionally or practically. Evelyn testified before a federal grand jury at 0900 on a Tuesday in October, in a building in Salt Lake City that smelled like carpet cleaning product and old documents. She sat in a chair in a wood-paneled room and answered questions for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and was precise and factual and did not editorialize, and went back to Redstone Valor that evening and ate dinner alone in the mess hall and didn't talk to anyone. Caswell called her twice a week with updates. The case against Victor Kane was being built on 3 pillars: the financial records linking him to the Sloan payment, Cord Dillon's testimony, which was detailed and specific and corroborated by the ballistic analysis from Caleb's computer, and the computer itself, whose database Mercer's technical team had fully decoded using the key Evelyn had provided, and which contained 7 contract records, 3 of which had now been matched by independent ballistic analysts to unsolved incidents in 2 states and 1 overseas jurisdiction. Kane had a lawyer, several of them, in the way that people who had built elaborate structures for doing terrible things always had several lawyers. And the lawyers were doing what lawyers did, which was looking for gaps. Caswell said the gaps were narrow. Caswell said he'd seen narrower gaps swallow cases whole, which was his way of being honest about the uncertainty without being defeatist about the odds. Dillon pled to a federal charge in November. The sentencing was scheduled for January. He gave his full cooperation in 2 recorded interviews that Caswell said were the most operationally detailed confessions he'd seen in 20 years of federal work, which was presumably a compliment to Dillon's memory or his desperation or both. Kane pled not guilty to everything, which surprised nobody. The trial date was set for the following spring. In the meantime, Evelyn taught, it started with Reyes's Thursday sessions and expanded without her quite deciding to expand it. Torres kept showing up. Bashi got better at his 1,000-meter consistency and then got interested in why he'd gotten better, which led to conversations about environmental reading that ran an hour past the end of the formal session. 2 of the federal law enforcement students from the second cohort rotation asked Voss if they could cross-train with the environmental module, which was technically an administrative irregularity, and Voss signed off on it without making it a discussion. She was not formally an instructor. Her employment status had migrated through several categories in the aftermath of the investigation: witness, consultant, facility resource, and none of them had resolved into something with a clear title or a formal contract. Voss had not mentioned the gap again. She had not mentioned his mention of it. The gap existed and she was filling it, and the paperwork existed somewhere in a state of administrative suspension that neither of them had forced into resolution. It was, she recognized, a version of how she'd always operated: functional without formal, present without title. She thought about that sometimes and wasn't sure what to do with it. In December, 4 months after the night on the spur, she drove to Montana. The property was 7 hours north, up through the high desert, into the transition zone where the desert gave way to grassland and then to the particular landscape of eastern Montana, wide and cold and horizontal, in a way that required adjustment if you'd been somewhere more vertical. She drove with the radio off and the heater on and watched the landscape change through the windshield and felt something in her chest doing something she couldn't fully characterize. She hadn't been back in 2 years. Before that, she'd come every summer without fail, for as long as she could remember. This property was where she'd grown up in the parts of growing up that mattered to her, the parts that weren't school or town or the ordinary business of childhood, but were this: the land, the range, the slow, patient work of learning what she'd learned. She pulled through the gate at 1600 in the last of the December light. The house was standing. Ruth had been checking on it. She'd mentioned that, in the calls that had become more regular in the last few months. The weekly check that Evelyn had started making and Ruth had clearly been waiting years for. The windows were intact. The porch step that had needed replacing for 2 years had been replaced, which meant Ruth had arranged it without asking, which was exactly the kind of thing Ruth did. She sat in the truck for a while before she went inside. The range was visible from the driveway. Even in December, with the grass flattened by frost and the sight lines muted by the gray afternoon light, she could see the logic of it. The way Caleb had placed the firing position to use the natural elevation, the way the berms at 500 and 1200 were positioned to create windbreak reference points, the way the ridge at the far end sat exactly right for the 1800-meter shot. He'd built this over 3 years. She'd watched parts of it happen, on summer visits, asking what he was doing and getting answers that were never quite the full answer. Now she had the full answer. She got out of the truck. She walked the property in the December cold, along the old fence line and across the frost-stiff grass, and up to the firing position, and then out to the 500 berm and back. The ground remembered her boots the way ground did, without ceremony. A hawk was working the field at the far end, low and methodical. She stood at the 1200 berm for a long time. The ridge at 1800 meters was bare against the gray sky. In summer it was visible through grass moving in the wind. In December it was just rock and sky, and the distance between here and there. She pulled out her phone and called Ruth. "Ruth." "You're there," Ruth said. Not a question. "Just got here." "How is it?" She looked at the ridge. "It's okay," she said. "It's good." Ruth was quiet for a moment. He kept that range up every year like it was his job. He'd spend the first week of every summer out there with a level and a tape measure, making sure everything was right. A pause. "He told me once it was for when you were ready." "Ready for what?" Evelyn said. "He didn't say." "That was Caleb." Ruth made a sound that was part laugh and mostly grief and entirely fond. Never finished a thought if he could help it. Evelyn looked at the firing position, at the worn patch in the ground where a shooter lay prone, smoothed and shaped by years of weight and practice. She had fit into that shape the first time she'd laid down in it, age 11, and she'd fit into it every time since. "I'm going to stay a few days," she said. "I'll come over tomorrow," Ruth said. "Bring food. Don't argue." "I won't argue." She went inside and turned on the heat and sat at the kitchen table in her jacket, while the house warmed up and looked at the walls of a place that still had Caleb in it, the way places held people after they were gone, not in any mystical sense, but in the accumulated evidence of a life. The tools hung in their specific places, the books on the shelf in the order he'd put them, the crack in the kitchen window frame that he'd been meaning to fix and hadn't. She was going to fix that window frame. She didn't know what else she was going to do yet, but she was going to fix the window frame. The Kane trial began in March. She drove down for it. Not to Salt Lake this time, but to a federal courthouse in Denver, where the jurisdictional calculus of the case had eventually landed. She was not required to be there. Caswell had told her that her grand jury testimony would be the basis of her contribution, and she didn't need to attend the trial itself. She drove down anyway. She sat in the public gallery for 3 days. Kane did not look like the version of him she'd constructed in her head during 14 months of focused investigation. He was 63, gray-haired, and looked like someone who managed money, careful, contained, expensive in the specific way of someone who'd spent a long time making sure nothing about his appearance said anything useful. He sat at the defense table with his lawyers and listened to the proceedings with the still attention of a man conserving himself. She watched him and felt very little, which was not what she'd expected, and was probably healthier than what she'd expected. On the second day, Cord Dillon testified. He was brought in from a federal facility in a different state, and he walked into the courtroom with a slight hitch in his left stride that would never fully resolve. The permanent consequence of a wound that had been treated well and healed cleanly, but had taken something that didn't come back. She watched him walk to the stand and thought about the shot that had made that hitch, and thought about the shot that had put her uncle's vehicle off a road in the dark, and tried to do the moral accounting of those two things, and found that the accounting was complicated and probably always would be. Dillon testified for 4 hours. I was specific and steady and used the kind of operational language that told a jury exactly what kind of work he'd done without requiring them to translate it. He described the Kane contract in detail. He described the Redstone Valor operation. He described the night of the 14th of September, 14 months ago, when he had lain on a ridge above a facility access road and waited for a vehicle to come around a curve. He described the shot. Evelyn sat in the gallery and listened to a man describe the moment her uncle died with the technical detachment of an after-action report, and she breathed and she held what she was holding and she didn't look away. After 4 hours, the prosecutor said, "No further questions," and the room exhaled, and Dillon was escorted out, and he didn't look at the gallery as he walked past. She wasn't sure if she'd wanted him to. Kane was convicted on all counts on a Friday in April. Caswell called her while she was on the range at Redstone Valor, in the middle of demonstrating a wind hold adjustment for a 1,800-meter shot to a group that included Reyes, Torres, Bashi, and 4 students from the new cohort rotation who had been unofficially adopted into the environmental module sessions. She stepped off the line and took the call. "Guilty," Caswell said. "All counts." Jury came back in 4 hours. She stood with the phone against her ear and looked at the desert. "Sentencing in August," he said. "Given the counts and the enhancement for the Cross incident, the prosecutor's office is looking at life without parole. They'll push for it." She watched the flags at 500 meters. The wind was doing the thing it did at this hour, the oscillation she'd been tracking for 10 months now, the pattern she could read as easily as print. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you did." "You did the work," Caswell said. "We assembled it." She ended the call. She stood at the edge of the range for another minute. Then she walked back to the line. Reyes was watching her. So were the others. "Verdict came in," Evelyn said. "Case I've been involved with." No one asked what case. They could see enough from her face to understand the shape of it. "You good?" Torres said. She thought about that honestly. "Getting there." She picked up the rifle. "Wind's going to cycle in about 4 minutes. When it does, I want everyone to call the shift before the flags show it. You should be able to see it in the mirage before the indicators move." She looked at the group. "Reyes, you're up first." Reyes settled behind her rifle. The range went quiet the way it did when everyone was paying attention to the same thing at once. Evelyn watched the mirage, watched the light play off the heat rising from the desert floor between the firing line and the 1,800-meter mark. Watched the shimmer that was never static, that was always telling you something if you knew how to look. She had been watching this range for 10 months. She would watch it for as long as she was here, and she was still figuring out how long that was. But it was longer than she'd planned when she'd arrived with a bucket and a cover story and a notebook full of careful observations. The wind shifted. "Now," she said. Reyes called it clean and correct before the flag at 500 moved. She called Voss into the administrative office in May and told him she wanted to formalize the arrangement. Not because she'd made a decision, exactly, but because the decision had been making itself for months while she wasn't looking directly at it, and she'd finally looked directly at it and found it was already done. "The instructor position," she said. Voss looked at her from across the desk. "The gap's been filled for 8 months. "I know, I filled it." She met his eyes. "I want a contract, formal title, and I want to redesign the environmental curriculum. The current version underweights terrain reading and overweights tool dependency. The students are learning to trust their equipment more than their observation, which is backwards." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You want to redesign a curriculum that's been running for 12 years. It needs redesigning. It's produced some of the best precision shooters in..." It's produced shooters who hit targets in controlled conditions and struggle when the conditions change, she said, because they were taught to solve for the shot, not read the environment. Those are different skills. She looked at him. My uncle could have been trained here and still been a better shooter than anyone this program has ever produced. Not because he was more talented, but because he understood that the environment is the primary variable and everything else is secondary. She paused. That's not in this curriculum. Voss looked at the desk. He looked at the window. He looked like a man running a calculation that wasn't strictly about what she was saying, but about what accepting what she was saying meant. And he was working through that with the deliberate honesty of someone who'd had 10 months to adjust to being wrong about something important. Send me your redesign in writing, he said. I'll review it. You'll approve it. He looked at her. Because I'm right, and you know I'm right, she said. And because you've been watching my students for 8 months, and you know the difference in what they're producing. He was quiet for a long moment. Send me the redesign, he said. I'll approve it. She stood up. Cross. He stopped her at the door. Your uncle's rifle. He said it carefully, like handling something fragile. The evidence hold will release at sentencing in August. After that, legally, it returns to the estate. I know. What are you going to do with it? She thought about Montana, about the firing position and the ridge and the 800-meter shot and the worn patch in the ground that fit her exactly. Bring it home, she said. August came with full desert heat and a sentencing that Caswell texted her in 6 words, life without parole. No surprises. Done. She was on the range when the text came in, which was where she was most mornings. And she read it and put the phone back in her pocket and finished what she was doing. That evening, she sat in the officer quarters, her permanent quarters now, which she'd stopped thinking of as temporary somewhere around the 4th month. And she pulled Caleb's old field manual from the box under the bed. Not the ballistic computer, which was still in federal custody for another 3 weeks. The manual, a battered spiral notebook with a cracked cover, filled with 20 years of his handwriting, observations about wind and terrain, and the physics of very long distances. She'd read it many times. She knew most of it by heart. She opened it to the last entry, which she'd found 3 months after his death, and hadn't been able to read properly until now. His handwriting was smaller on this page, more compressed, like he'd been trying to fit more into less space. He'd written, notes for E, if she ever goes looking. And then, the shot is the last part. The environment is everything before it. Learn the ground. The ground will tell you what the wind will do before the wind does it. Stop looking at the indicators. Look at what the indicators are reading. She'd taught that to Reyes on a Thursday morning in September, almost word for word, without knowing where it had come from. It had come from here. It had come from him. She sat with the notebook until the light went, and then sat a little longer in the dark, not doing anything, just letting the weight of what had been and the shape of what was settle into some kind of balance. Caleb Cross had spent 15 years teaching her the most precise skill she would ever know, and he had put it in her the same way he'd built that range in Montana. Carefully, systematically, without telling her exactly what it was for, trusting that she would figure it out when she was ready. She had been a maintenance technician nobody noticed for 6 months, and she had been a witness, and she had been a shooter in the dark on a desert spur, and she had been the woman sitting in a federal courtroom listening to the technical description of her uncle's death without looking away. And she was an instructor now on a range in the Utah high desert, teaching people to read ground and wind in the patient language of very long distances. Caleb had known she would find her way to something like this. He'd left the material and trusted the student. That was the thing about being taught by someone who believed in what they were teaching. The teaching didn't stop when the teacher was gone. It kept going. It moved through the people it had touched, and into the work those people did, and through that work into everyone who came after. She closed the notebook. She set it on the shelf where it would stay. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did at this hour, cooling, settling, the thermal reversal that she could time to within 90 seconds. The flags on the range would be moving northwest in approximately 4 minutes. She knew this without looking. She knew it the way she knew the oscillation cycles and the draw shelf geometry and the specific way the light changed on Blackstone Ridge in the last 40 minutes before dark. She knew this ground. She had earned the knowing. In the morning, she would be on the line at 0600. Reyes would be early. Torres would bring bad coffee and apologize for it. Bashi would have a question he'd been holding since the previous session, The kind of question you held because you wanted to wait until you were sure you were asking the right version of it. She would answer it, and the next one. And she would watch the flags and read the mirage and teach the ground to the next generation of people who needed to understand what it said. That was the work. She had been invisible once because she let them see only what they expected. But the truth of a person, the real measure of what they carry and what they can do, has never needed recognition to exist. It only needs the right moment, and the patience to wait for it, and the skill to make it count when it comes. Evelyn Cross had all three. To everyone watching this story, the world is full of people who go unnoticed, carrying knowledge others never think to ask about, doing work that holds everything else up, waiting in plain sight for the moment the world finally has to see them. Never mistake silence for absence. Never mistake invisibility for weakness. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one